Patricia Bright, the founder of the Luxe Movement, and I want to thank you for joining me on the very first episode of the Creative Endeavoring podcast. When I first established TLM back in 2017, I didn't envision it evolving into a mentorship lifestyle brand or even hosting a podcast. I was living in New York City at the time, balancing a full-time career in the optical world alongside all my creative ambitions, and I had a lot. And organically, through the work, I just started mentoring other artists. And we focused on their music, their performance, sometimes branding, or any upcoming projects that they had. And I did this for about 3 to 4 years. And honestly, at the time, I wasn't thinking of this as something I would ever pursue full time. I had my own mentor and vocal coach, and I was just focused on my own goals as an aspiring singer, and I was enjoying it, especially living in New York City. But life definitely has a funny way of kind of pushing you towards your evolution, even when you're not really planning for it. And for me, I think just like a lot of other people, that time was during the pandemic. I lost my job, but what showed up in its place ended up being more people reaching out for support. So I had the opportunity to mentor all different types of artists and entrepreneurs. We were all kind of like struggle busting it together. And mentoring became obviously the one thing that kept me connected, but it also kept me expansive. And it was important because it was during a time where everything just felt so, uncertain, which is like the polite word for it. But most importantly, what it did was it gave me a completely new perspective on creation. Because during the pandemic, all that was relevant to people was the fact that everything in their lives became highlighted. And regardless of what my client's creative outlet was, there was this disconnect. And it wasn't just from their art, but it was from the purpose of creating that art. And I would see it show up in really practical ways. Like I had artists working with music that didn't really complement their natural vocal resonance, or they were like forcing themselves into these genres that didn't actually fit their personality or their character's personality. They were basically confining themselves to, trends, and they were creating from habit, from expectation and external influences. They were not creating from conscious intention. And, it makes sense because by default, most of us just kind of gravitate towards whatever's relevant at the time. That's what you're kind of taught to do, especially in creative industries. The industry sets the tone and you follow. And it's not because you lack creativity, it's because as a society, we are conditioned to consume and replicate. So that disconnect that I was observing from my clients was really just a need for creative release that wasn't being met. I mean, creatives are, and this is conversational language. The neuroscience behind this is way more complex, and, we'll dive deeper into that later in the series, but creatives are more right brain dominant. The imagination, the emotional processing, the intuition, that's our home base as artists. But we live in a world that rewards left brain dominance. And that's the logic, the productivity, the structure, and like all things analytics. So we end up moving back and forth between creation and survival. And when that tension isn't really understood or regulated, as a society, we label it as anxiety or depression or even creative blocks, when really it's just our nervous system trying to create in a survival-based world. And when you create from that place, the work can become very mechanical, right? You are technically solid, you're hitting all the notes, you are applying all the techniques, but now you are emotionally disconnected from the process. And creativity turns into a curriculum instead of an energetic release. So, the work might look good on the surface, but it doesn't create stability or, fulfillment or even a healthy, solid foundation for your artistry. And that was something I learned to embody through my own mentor and vocal coach of over 20 years with the late Ankara. He definitely elevated my artistry and my stage presence, but most importantly, my life off stage. And he taught me that in order for your art to be solid, you had to be solid. And he emphasized the importance of the mind, body, and soul connection. So I think a lot of these concepts became very natural to me because I grew up exposed to a lot of like holistic and spiritual ways of understanding life. So I knew that there were like layers to reality that most people didn't really talk about, and that not everything needed to fit neatly into language or logic to be real. At that time, I think anything outside of conventional medicine was usually labeled as woo woo. But to give you an example, me and my family had traveled to our city in Brazil to see a médico espiritual, which is a spiritual doctor, and we witnessed like legit healing. So I understood the connection to something bigger. So my mind didn't like immediately reject what it couldn't explain logically, I guess. I learned to observe first. And I'm grateful because that openness changed not only how I perceive life, but how I worked with people. And I started to understand that creativity didn't open through effort, it opened through regulation. And that part of the work I owe to a piece of wisdom that was shared with me in 2011 by my beautiful grandmother. She gave me a book called The Silva Mind Control Method. And I know the title sounds super intense, but the work itself is actually very structured, and it teaches you how to intentionally access specific mental states like alpha and theta. And it explains how these states affect your creativity, your intuition, your perception, and even your health, how you regulate your nervous system. And this guy ran institutes and he worked with athletes, teaching them how to use imagination as a form of preparation, which we now understand through neuroscience as neuroplasticity. And the book introduced exactly that the mind is not fixed, it is programmable. And at the time, I was 24 years old, living a very New York City hustle lifestyle. So I only understood so much of it then. That kind of work wasn't something that you just downloaded overnight. It integrates slowly. And I also wasn't thinking about any of this as like a framework or a method. I was just kind of integrating it into my own life. I observed my grandmother and I was using it to improve my focus and my emotional regulation, my memory, and most importantly, I was training my imaging faculty. And after several months of applying his methods, I had the realization of just how powerful the mind actually is. And not in a mystical way, like it's often portrayed, but in a very practical, embodied way. We are capable of far more than we are taught. We are creators, and it led me down many rabbit holes into understanding why this worked, not just that it did. I mean, the book was published in the 1970s, so obviously we had come a long way since then. And I wanted to understand the psychology behind it, the neuroscience aspect, the metaphysical representation of it, all of it. And so over the years, the work kind of naturally began to organize itself into something more structured. And what I was working with wasn't creativity in theory, it was the subconscious mind. And we'll definitely be going into more depth about the subconscious mind later in the series. But maybe for those of you who aren't familiar, it is basically everything that runs automatically. Okay, even when you perform or create. And In music, especially, you can't override the subconscious with willpower. You can't think your way into resonance. Those live below conscious thought, and they're encoded through repetition, your nervous system state, and internal imagery, which is your imagination. And this is something that psychology has actually been studying since the 1960s. One of the founders of positive psychology, and I'm going to totally botch his name, but Csikszentmihalyi, spent years studying artists, athletes, surgeons, scientists, and all these different types of innovators. And he discovered the flow state, what you might have heard people describe as like being in the zone or, going with the flow. And conscious researchers and metaphysics acknowledge this flow state. So it's not mystical. It is a measurable shift in how the brain and nervous system operate. And around that same time period, we have Jose Silva with Mind Control teaching people how to intentionally access similar internal focus states. So we have the shifts in brain rhythms, the increased internal imagery, the reduced mental noise, two completely different fields using different terminology, but all pointing towards the same human mechanism. And so once you experience that flow state and you feel what it's like to create without resistance, you start to realize that creativity isn't random, that it actually follows a rhythm. So my understanding became this. If creativity is a state, not just an output, not just something that you do, then learning how to access, regulate, and return to that state is essential. And that realization is really where the concept of creative endeavoring was born. And this podcast is a space where all these ideas are going to be explored. It's really an accumulation of everything that came before it, my own personal development, the work I've done with my clients, years of research and conversations with like-minded people and professionals, and a lot of observation about how the mind, the body, and creativity actually interact with each other. And it became very clear over time that this conversation goes far beyond art or music. It's really about how we live and perceive life. Creativity is something that we are constantly participating in through the way we think, the way we respond to challenges, the way we interpret our situations and our experiences, and the way that we shape our lives on a day-to-day basis. So naturally, the Luxe Movement evolved, and what started as mentoring artists kind of slowly expanded into something much broader, a mentorship lifestyle brand that's centered around conscious creation. So my intention with this podcast isn't to provide, surface level inspiration. It's a structured, grounded conversation that is designed to help you understand what it means to be a conscious creator and how sound, music, creativity, and the nervous system kind of all play a role in restoring that connection within yourself. So take what resonates, leave behind what doesn't, and let's begin.